It's a pleasure to be here with such a distinguished panel and such a distinguished audience. The focus of my brief presentation will be on some of the instruments that international development agencies have in helping countries better manage or better cope with addressing or trying to address food price volatility. And I'll focus on sort of three elements. One is just to recap very briefly the challenges. And that will form the backdrop of sort of the presentation of where I see priorities for the discussion of the G20. Some of the response instruments that are currently available and have been used by international agencies, and then a few points on coordination. So first, just a basic, this may be quite simplistic, but it's quite illustrative. You know, just looking at three elements. You know, what you see from the late 1990s is a gradual but continual increase in food consumption. That's the orange line. You see volatile production. And you see a decline in the stocks significantly in the early 2000s, and then sort of production volatility matched by stock volatility. And in some way, that's just an identity, given that some of the stock data is just the residual of consumption and production. But what's interesting is the coincidence of where through production volatility, there's large drops below consumption, both in 2007 and then again in 2010-11, where stocks were low. So there is some association of fundamentals to the subsequent price spikes that were observed in both 2008 and 2011. But the positive news is, you know, we had the 2008 shock, and there was a significant focus. It helped focus attention of the international agencies and the donor community. There was a scale up in support for agriculture, coupled with favorable weather. And in 2011 or 10-11, you know, a lot of the developing countries had a higher production. They were more resilient to the price shock than they were in 2008, which dampened some of the pass-through of the current price spike relative to 2008. And the main shock driving the production declines in 2009-10 was production declines in developed countries. You know, significant declines in stock holdings, 25% declines in developed countries, largely weather-induced, starting with the droughts in Russia. But given that developed countries account for 70% of trade, the improved production in developing countries wasn't large enough to offset those declines. But it illustrates that, you know, there has been some return to the increased attention to developing countries and trying to improve their production productivity recently. But the overall message, as was mentioned earlier, is that, you know, the outlook across many agencies who estimate these things is that world prices for food will remain higher and more volatile than 2007 levels, at least. And that sort of the short-term volatility seems to be becoming a longer-term phenomenon. But the implication seems to be in terms of a forward-looking response. As Peter suggested, you know, focus on productivity growth as the primary entry point, linking farmers to markets, linking on the trade discussion, and then trying to do a more effective job at local coping strategies. So I'll touch a bit now on the instruments which have tried to implement this response in the near term. So first on the what can the international agencies provide for the longer term productivity growth? And essentially it's analytical support and financing. And the challenge is, how do you package that in a way which is sort of an effective response to generating productivity growth? You know, Peter mentioned the decline in cereal yield growth, and here's the estimates declining dramatically from around 3% to around 1%, rising recently to 1.5%. But I think that's where the focus needs to be. And not only raising that growth rate, but make it more resilient to reduce the volatility in production that was illustrated in the previous figure. And there's a number of activities, as you know, to do that. You know, improving the use of existing technology, better water management, tenure security, ag research for the longer term scale up in more resilient varieties. And the support typically from international agencies is either budget support, as in Ghana, sectoral budget support, or through direct investment operations. And I'll come back a little bit to the longer term agenda at the G20, which I think should almost dominate the discussions on action. The second is on short-term responses. Typically, the development agencies have responded with sort of expedited processing of financing to countries for activities focusing on mitigating the impacts of price spikes, such as compensating for revenue losses from reduced taxes and tariffs, scaling up safety nets, and then short-term production for next season supply responses. And there's a lot of experience now on some of the impacts of that through the rapid response mechanisms. But those have been fairly positive in the sense that they've reached a large number of beneficiaries. But I think one of the key sort of objectives of these short-term instruments is to give governments more options on how to respond to prevent them from taking these more drastic policy responses which amplify the impacts on global prices. So finally, I just have one last slide on the coordinated action. And I think this comes back to the G20 agenda on implementation of scale-up of financing support to productivity growth. What we already have is a G20 commitment at L'Aquila to provide $22 billion in additional financing to scale up longer term productivity growth and improve resilience. And there was the establishment of a global agriculture and food security program to implement some of that commitment, of which only $1 billion of the 22 has been received, has been pledged to that fund, of which only half of that has actually been received and allocated. So what I hope is that the focus on these other aspects don't divert attention from that already significant commitment which hasn't been fulfilled yet. So I think a reminder to the G20 is longer term productivity growth is still a key part of improving resilience and longer term volatility reductions in food markets, and that there are existing commitments that need to be filled for that. Going back to Peter's earlier point as well, I think the coordinated action among developing countries should start at the country level, because I think that's where a lot of activities come together from all these differing financing sources in the analytical work to develop sort of comprehensive multi-donor programs to address country level actions on improving food security. There's a lot of regional initiatives which need to be supported jointly by international agencies, such as the CAREP initiative. And then there's some of these global level programs with an effort to try and improve aid effectiveness. So that's on implementation of investment programs by multilateral or development agencies. The second is, as was mentioned previously, there's been this joint policy paper by various international institutions on policy options on various topics for consideration for the G20. And some of these have already been touched on: the trade policies, the biofuels, strategic reserves, safety nets. And I think all are important. I think there's differing extent of agreement, of analysis on some of these in terms of the consensus on the actual policy recommendation. But again, I think the key is the first one, and if we only do one thing, I think it should be the first one in terms of improving the commitment on productivity growth. And then I think for institutions like IFPRI, I think there's still a number of important research questions on some of these other factors, which can be pursued in the interim. So I think I'll leave my comments there. And